As clergy and spiritual teachers dedicated to doing our jobs well, most of us can easily learn the principles of boundary issues as they apply to our professional role. The hard part is putting those principles into practice. Whether newly ordained or highly experienced, we are also human beings with human needs for love, for friendship, and for connection. How to maintain our professional integrity while appropriately addressing our personal life is the real day-to-day challenge of boundaries.
Mother, I told you the bishop has very strict rules about not dating anyone who might be in the congregation.
A single minister should not date someone in his or her congregation, because what it does is it creates a dual relationship. It creates a relationship where you have a professional relationship and a personal, intimate relationship. A clergy person cannot be the person's minister on the one hand and their lover on the other, because those two things get confused.
There are plenty of matchmakers in Jewish communities very eager to make arrangements for single rabbis, male and female.
Young single people going to small towns, do not try to fall in love with and date anybody in your congregation. Although historically, when ministers were mostly male, the majority of them found their wives in their church.
And some of those relationships have been just fine. But for each one that has worked out fine, I also talked to people who were in that situation who it has not worked out for. And I have no need to go back to those days and to those relationships as long as people were not exploited in the process. But I think we know more now than we did then. And so our decisions and our choices today are informed by new information.
That 30 or 40 years ago, dating was much more formal, and there was a lot less intimacy for a longer period of time, so that you dated without significant physical contact for quite a while. And by the time you entered into more personal physical contact, you were pretty sure whether or not you were going to be in a long-term relationship with this person. So you didn't have jilted ex-lovers in your congregation. Now people become intimate so very quickly. That's the norm in our communities and in our clergy communities, that there are assumptions, if not reality, that you've suddenly become very close to this person, and when you break up, it's much messier.
I think it's hard. I think it's very hard, and I think the boundaries get blurred again, because as one young minister who is single, is going to serve a rural church, said to me, the kind of person that I'm seeking as a life partner needs to be somebody who's committed to the church, because that's going to be my life work. I want somebody who's a Christian and can share my faith. So I'm more apt to find that person in the church. And if I have the only church in town, what am I going to do?
I think what happens in a relationship where you are the teacher is that you set a pattern of dependency in religious matters that over time may become unhealthy.
Let's say you're attracted to a student and you're single and you would like to develop a relationship with them. Then you need to find another spiritual mentor for them. Now, in the early days of Buddhism, that wasn't easy to do. There were very few teachers, and they were widely scattered. Or it's very difficult for people in a small community where there just aren't any options. Do you tell your student who is training in Buddhism, go become a Methodist? They're not going to be satisfied with that.
The pastor was intentional in her desire to empower the parishioner. If we're going to pursue this relationship, then I can't be your pastor, and you're going to have to find another pastor. Do you want that to happen? And it gave the choice over to him. She immediately went to talk to the bishop, so that the bishop knew what was going on. The bishop could give advice.
It is one of those wonderful landmines. It's not illegal, it's not necessarily unethical, but it's full of potential problems.
You certainly don't want to enter a relationship where someone who loves you has placed you on a pedestal. I just think there's all sorts of negative reverberations down the road.
People often ask when we're doing trainings on boundary issues with spiritual teachers, they say, but yes, I know so-and-so who did it. And they seem to have done it successfully. They've married their student. Or, well, this doesn't apply across the board. Aren't there exceptions to every rule? And wouldn't it be possible for somebody theoretically to have a romantic relationship with their student and it doesn't hurt them? Everybody wants to be the exception. We secretly hope that maybe we could get away with crossing some of these boundaries or violating some of the precepts in a special circumstance, of course, and it would be all right. But it just isn't true. It just isn't true. We're all subject to the law of cause and effect.
Hi, I'm here about your want ad for a best friend.
Yeah, friendship is a funny thing. They say if you can count them on one hand, you're blessed.
I think most of us have come to the conclusion that you cannot be personal friends with your students.
A person with whom you can share, your private world with. For me, it's been healthy to have someone outside of my congregation. I'm able to be freer because I know it will have no direct impact on my ability to serve.
If you're a personality who likes to see themselves surrounded by friends, and you're using the congregation as your arena for all those many friendships, I think that's unhealthy.
The first is jealousy. That if, let's say you have a group of 50 students that you work with in an intimate way, and maybe a larger group of 100. If you're special friends with 3 of them, what about the other 97? How do they feel?
Some of my colleagues say you should never be friends with any parishioner. I think that's hard to do. I think that's unrealistic. But I think you do it in a way that is considerate of the congregation. So instead of at the church picnic when everybody's there exclusively sitting with the family that's your friends, maybe you do something on Saturday, you go to a movie together, you go hiking, or you do something, but it's not a church activity.
What's at issue here is the commodity, the currency is time with the teacher, or time with the minister, or time with the priest. That's sacred time, and people have so little sacred time in their life.
We received 4 invitations for Break the Fast at the end of Yom Kippur from congregants. I called them and I said, "Now look, the rule is I go where my kids want to go." I said I follow them, and they were cool. I did it in a funny way, and it's a nice way. I've learned how to present a boundary in a comforting, tactful way, as opposed to doing it with tension. If you express a boundary with tension, it often is then seen as a form of rejection. But if you can do it with humor.
Yes, I did make some friends with people within my congregation, but I always had to keep in mind that first and foremost, I was their rabbi. And I think that they wanted, to be close and to really have a very open friendship. But it didn't feel entirely safe to me to be able to do that because what I would be saying could be affecting their experience in the congregation.
And I've distinguished in my own mind between friendliness and friendship. And there are people that I connect with more readily in my parish, and there are some people in my parish I don't like. And there are people that I enjoy spending more time with than other people. I distinguish that with friendships. I look for my friendships other places. And the difference for me is that there always is that pastoral aspect to our relationship, so that it isn't precisely mutual. I'm not, in our friendly interchange, I'm not unloading my stuff with the congregant.
I admit that I can still be friends with people in my congregation, but I need to be aware about crossing boundaries. My role is, in fact, to be their spiritual leader and to be the one to take care of them, not for them to take care of me. I should get my support from outside the congregation.
I can be friends, and I am friends with the people I practice with. And I feel an enormous connection and heart feeling with the people that I practice with. But they're not personal or social friends, because I don't want to compromise the depth and vastness of the relationship that I have with them.
And board members, and eventually I had to deal with them in the clergy board relationship. And because it was a congregation that had a great deal of political problems, it eventually led to hurt feelings on both sides. So then I developed a general rule from that, which was not that you don't make friends with congregants. And then we moved up here and practiced that rule quite for the first few years, and found that we had no friends because it was a smaller Jewish community.
Colleagues of mine that have struggled with this, what they've ended up doing is just making sure that they maintain relationships outside of that immediate community. And that may mean driving 50 or 100 miles to an urban setting once a month to visit friends.
You could become friends, and I did become friends with many parishioners. And there was a level of mutuality. They would say, come here anytime, you don't have to call. But there always was a stage at which you didn't go beyond. You were still the pastor, and you were still the person who had responsibility to the wider community, plus you had that whole set of agenda of confidentialities. You couldn't talk about what the parish council was arguing about. You obviously couldn't bring the conflicts going on in the parish into that setting. You couldn't ask them for a loan personally. So there were limitations even in the friendship and the level of mutuality that was there.
Sorry, Father. On Sundays, you're the pastor, but Monday through Friday, you're just another customer with a 72-hour warranty. No refunds.
Because they can happen in several different forms, dual relationships can be confusing to those of us working as religious professionals. A dual relationship simply means that an individual with whom we have a professional relationship, that is, we serve as their clergy person or spiritual teacher, may also have an additional relationship with us.
Dual relationships are just realities in all of our lives. In ministry, the challenge is that we may be the minister for that person, and they in the community may provide other services. They may have a business, they may be a healthcare provider. I think it's inevitable in some settings, particularly in rural settings where there are no other options. You know, there's only one car mechanic in town, then there may be times when we would need to use that person. The problem comes if the person's services, let's say, are not adequate. And so in terms of our personal business of needing their services, we're not getting what we need, but we have this pastoral relationship with them. So we're hesitant then to say we need to go somewhere else to get services, and it becomes very complicated.
One of my students is a contractor and wanted to do the remodeling on the meditation hall. We ran into all kinds of difficulties, and in the end, we replaced her as the contractor, and she's never been able to practice here since then. It was a very powerful lesson, painful lesson.
In order to maintain an appropriate boundary in the ministerial relationship, that other relationships needed to be sought outside of that congregational setting. Now, then there's the murky zones of what if one is in a small community and the best ophthalmologist, for example, happens to be a congregant? What do you do?
And is particularly in a small community or, for example, in the African American community, that becomes very difficult if we want to support the community and we want to support the members of the community, whether or not we utilize their services and also try to be their minister.
Well, and that happens in big communities as well. You know, they view that almost as disloyalty. Why are you not going to our dentist? We've got great dentists. You're going to the other congregation's dentists. So even when there are choices, people often feel confused about why you're making a choice away from a congregant.
We're taught in the therapeutic world singular roles, whereas as a pastor, you often have multiple roles, not even dual relationships, but multiple roles. Today, the person that I hire is the person who I need to minister tomorrow, is the person who I will be going to the hospital the next day, and it's the person who next year will be writing the checks at the church of my own salary.
If a teacher is also a trained psychotherapist and is working with the same person in both roles, that gives them a kind of double whammy from the standpoint of power and authority that freights and weights the relationship in a way that I think is very hazardous, extremely hazardous.
So I was asked early on to do a wedding for a cousin. But because she was my family, I was very lax about it and did the wedding. And the wedding, they were divorced within a year. And I realized that if I'd used my normal standards of working with a couple, I could have said, well, look, I see some problems here, and you might want to get some help. But because I was a family member doing that, I didn't. And so now, anytime an extended family member asks my services as a rabbi, I say, especially marriage or wedding, I say, you need to get your prenuptials from another colleague.
A personal example of dual roles would be an individual that I provided ministry services as he was going through a painful divorce. 2 years later, this person turns out to be our treasurer at the church. Now, because his role as a treasurer is radically different than his role as a parishioner in need, then expectations start to blend themselves. You were there for me, you were my friend, and I will start to make decisions based on past loyalties. And in essence, both senior pastor and myself had to walk this individual and let him know, your job, your role at this time is to be the treasurer, not to be my friend.
This is part of what's tricky about this whole thing. Because on the one hand, we're in a ministerial role of leadership where people are looking to us for spiritual guidance and support and so forth and so on. On the other hand, we're an employee of this group of people. So they're our bosses. But again, I think what is important about that is that we all recognize that that's what's going on and that there be some honest, direct conversations with the leadership of congregations and their person in ministry about those dynamics so that the dynamics don't get in the way then of either the role of minister or the role of employee and employer.
In lieu of a gift, will you accept Visa or MasterCard?
Because students are very grateful for the teaching, they want to give you something back.
Often in place of trying to tell you or find other ways of affirming you, people will just spontaneously want to give you gifts, either financial gifts or special tokens, or say, you know, use my summer cabin.
Because from my culture, growing up in the Philippines, my father as a pastor was compensated before with more material things than cash. So we were able to receive gifts as they are given as gifts, and sometimes, you know, part of the compensation. But for here, I have to think twice about gifts.
I think there are reasons why we would be suspicious of gift giving in the kind of political climate that we live in, because it's a big problem. Buying buying favors. I think that it depends on the spirit.
Well, they should learn to be gracious and accept gifts. And sometimes, like I said, because they're not used to gift giving and generosity and hospitality, they have something to learn from other culture, like from our culture. And because we are a gift-giving culture, they should just accept it graciously. And it doesn't mean anything. It's not buying them out. It's not a quid pro quo. They're not expecting something in return.
I think it's important, first of all, in just terms of myself, not to become so rigid about that you can't, first of all, say, well, gee, thank you, and not move right into the professional distance role that says, well, you know, I can't do that. To, first of all, recognize that this is something that is very significant to them and to me, that they would feel that way. But then secondly, what do you do with that? I think there are times in ministry when I received gifts. I received sometimes when I would have a wedding or a funeral. People would say, well, this is for the church, and Father, this is for you. Many times I just graciously accepted that. And then I tried to be responsible in how I used those resources, either for my own favorite charities or for other experiences that I would like to pass on. I think that had a certain legitimacy to it. There are other gifts and other circumstances where I saw yellow lights going on, if not red flares.
A man in a church who had a wonderful cabin up on an island, and he was very generous in sharing time in that cabin. Then we reached a point where he wanted to be the lay leader of the church, and the nominating committee did not choose him. And he came to me and he said, I want you to really advocate for him. And I said, I can't. This is a decision of the congregation and of this particular committee, and I'm not going to interfere. Well, he says, I've given you the cabin a lot. You should do this for me. So then it became clear that it was that pulling in favors, at which point we stopped using the cabin.
I am much more careful about gifts for my children than even for me, because it's very clear if you give my children gifts, you are trying to get to me.
Christmas, you get more cookies than you need or probably want. But again, that's a way I think that parishioners say, you know, thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for walking with us. So it has something to do with sort of monetary value, but it also has to do with what's just common sense appropriate and what isn't.
So I think teachers have to be very careful about that, to acknowledge that students are grateful and they want to give something. But I constantly tell people what's most precious to me is your spiritual practice.